You think Appalachian mountain folks only ate cornbread and beans? Think again. These remote hollows and mining camps served up some of the most inventive, practical, and surprisingly flavorful lunches in American history. They're real meals packed by real families across the mountains of West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Virginia from the 1880s through the 1960s. Let's dig into 25 hillbilly lunch classics you never knew were actually keeping Appalachian workers alive in coal mines, logging camps, and tobacco fields. Pepperoni Rolls. Back in 1927, Italian immigrant Giuseppe Argiro opened a bakery in Fairmont, West Virginia, right in the heart of coal country. The miners had a problem. They needed lunches that could survive 12-hour shifts in hot, dusty mines without spoiling. Argiro's solution became a West Virginia institution. He took soft bread dough, wrapped it around sticks of pepperoni, and baked them until golden. The pepperoni's natural oils and salt acted as preservatives, while the sealed dough package kept out coal dust and mine grime. You'd roll out simple white bread dough, place a whole 6-inch pepperoni stick in the center, sometimes add a slice of mozzarella, then roll it tight and bake until golden brown. When a miner bit into one deep underground, he got that spicy, greasy, salty punch of meat and bread that made black coffee taste like luxury. This wasn't fancy food. It was survival food that could handle 100-degree tunnels without refrigeration. If you're enjoying this journey through food history, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss future videos. Fried apple pies. These weren't your grandmother's lattice-topped beauties cooling on a windowsill. Mountain hand pies were portable, practical, and built to last a workday. From the 1880s through the 1950s, Appalachian women would take dried apple slices, preserved from the previous fall, and rehydrate them overnight in a little water and sugar, sometimes with cinnamon if the family could afford it. The next morning, they'd roll out biscuit dough thin, cut it into circles about 6 inches across, and spoon the apple mixture onto one half. Fold it over, crimp the edges with a fork to seal tight, then drop them into a cast-iron skillet with hot lard or bacon grease. The pies would fry until both sides turned golden and crispy, creating a sealed pocket that kept the filling from leaking out. These hand pies could survive being tossed into a lunch pail, riding on horseback to a logging camp, or sitting in the sun while a farmer worked his tobacco. The fried crust acted like armor, and the concentrated sweetness of those dried apples made them feel like dessert, even though they were practical fuel. Fried green tomatoes. When frost threatened in September, mountain families stripped their tomato plants of every unripe fruit. Waste wasn't an option. These hard, sour green tomatoes became a staple in lunch pails across Appalachia from the 1890s onward. The preparation was simple but required skill. You'd slice the green tomatoes thick, about a ½ inch, so they wouldn't fall apart. Dip them in buttermilk if you had it, or just water if you didn't, then dredge through cornmeal mixed with salt and pepper. Some families added a little flour to help the coating stick. Into a hot skillet with bacon grease they'd go, frying until each side developed a crispy, golden brown crust. The heat would soften the tomato just enough to create a contrast, crunchy outside, tangy and firm inside. These weren't just clever, they were strategic. Fried green tomatoes could sit at room temperature all morning without getting soggy or spoiling. Loggers and miners would eat them cold, straight from the pail, enjoying that sharp, acidic bite that cut through the heaviness of biscuits and fatback. Cornbread and buttermilk. This combination defined mountain lunches for generations. From the 1850s through the 1950s, sharecroppers, coal miners, and timber workers carried this simple pairing in mason jars and tin pails. The night before, mothers would bake a skillet of cornbread, stone-ground cornmeal, buttermilk, a little lard, and maybe an egg if the chickens were laying. The result was dense, crumbly, and substantial enough to fill a working man's belly. Come morning, they'd crumble chunks of that cornbread into a wide-mouth mason jar and pour cold buttermilk over it until the bread was nearly covered. By lunchtime, the cornbread had absorbed the tangy buttermilk, creating a thick, porridge-like mixture you could eat with a spoon. The sourness of the buttermilk acted as a preservative, keeping everything safe even in summer heat. This wasn't food for pleasure. It was cheap protein, calories, and that probiotic punch of cultured milk that settled hard-working stomachs. Men would sit in tobacco fields or mine shaft entrances, spooning this mixture and washing it down with well water, fueling themselves for another 6 hours. Stack cake slices. The Appalachian stack cake wasn't just dessert. It was portable wealth in the lunch pail. Dating back to the early 1800s, this cake was made from thin layers of dense, cookie-like rounds stacked with dried apple filling. But here's what made it lunch-worthy. It actually got better with age. Families would bake these cakes a week before they were needed, letting the moisture from the apple filling seep into the dry layers, softening them into something almost fudgy. A mother would cut thick slices and wrap them in wax paper for the lunch pail. Each layer was made from sorghum or molasses-sweetened dough, rolled thin and baked hard, creating rounds that could survive being transported without crumbling. Between each layer went a thick paste of dried apples, cooked down with sugar and spices until it was almost jammy. The beauty was in the preservation. The low moisture content meant it wouldn't mold. The sugar and spice acted as preservatives, and the whole thing could sit in a cool place for weeks. Miners and loggers savored these slices as their midday treat, the dense sweetness providing quick energy and a taste of home in rough camps. Ham sandwiches on thick sliced bread. Before Wonder Bread, there was farm bread, massive loaves baked once a week in wood-fired ovens. From the 1870s through the 1940s, Appalachian families would slice this bread thick, nearly an inch across, creating sandwiches that were more bread than filling, but exactly what hard labor demanded. The ham was usually country ham, salt-cured and aged for months in smokehouses, sliced thin but intensely flavored. A single slice of that salty, ruby-red ham between two slabs of dense homemade bread created a lunch that could last. The bread would be slightly stale by morning, which was actually perfect. It held together better and didn't get soggy. Some folks would spread a little lard on the bread for moisture. Others added nothing at all. The salt from the ham would slowly penetrate the bread as it sat in the lunch pail, seasoning each bite. These sandwiches went into coal mines, tobacco fields, and logging camps. They weren't fancy, but they delivered what workers needed: carbohydrates for energy, protein for muscle, and enough salt to replace what sweat took away during 10-hour shifts in brutal conditions. Cold biscuits with sorghum. Leftover biscuits never went to waste in the mountains. From the 1880s through the 1960s, families would save the previous night's biscuits for next-day lunches. These weren't the fluffy, buttery southern biscuits you'd find at a restaurant. These were hard-working biscuits made with lard and minimal rising agent, designed to fill stomachs cheaply. By morning, they'd be cold and slightly firm, but that was the point. A worker would split the biscuit in half and drizzle dark sorghum molasses over each side. Sorghum was cheaper than white sugar and provided deep, almost earthy sweetness with a mineral tang that white sugar couldn't match. The thick syrup would soak into the dense biscuit, creating pockets of sweetness throughout. Some folks added a smear of butter if they had it, but most just relied on the sorghum. This combination delivered quick energy from the molasses and staying power from the wheat and lard. Timber workers would eat these standing up, syrup dripping onto their boots, getting that sugar rush before attacking another day of felling trees with handsaws and axes in the steep mountain terrain. Leather britches. Don't let the name fool you. These weren't pants. Leather britches were green beans, strung on thread and dried until they looked like old leather strips. This preservation method, used throughout Appalachia from the 1700s onward, turned summer's abundance into winter and spring sustenance. Women would string fresh green beans, Kentucky Wonders were preferred, on heavy thread, creating long garlands hung from rafters in the cabin. They'd dry for weeks until brown and leathery. Come lunch packing time, a handful of these dried beans would go into a tin pail. At the worksite, they'd be eaten as is, tough and chewy, requiring serious jaw work but providing fiber and minerals. Some miners would pour hot water over them from a thermos, letting them rehydrate slightly before eating. The beans had an intense, concentrated flavor, earthy, slightly smoky if they'd hung near the wood stove, and deeply vegetable. They tasted like hard work and forward planning. Modern folks might find them unappetizing, but to a coal miner in 1920, they represented summer sunshine in the middle of a dark shaft, and the foresight of a wife who knew how to keep her family fed year-round. Salmon patties. Canned salmon was one of the few luxury proteins mountain families could afford, and they stretched it as far as possible. From the 1920s through the 1960s, salmon patties became a lunch staple. The night before, mothers would open a can of pink salmon, bones and skin included, nothing wasted, and mash it with leftover cornbread or stale breadcrumbs, an egg if available, and a little chopped onion. Form the mixture into patties and fry them in bacon grease until both sides developed a crispy, golden crust. By morning, these patties were cold and firm, perfect for the lunch pail. They wouldn't fall apart, wouldn't spoil in moderate temperatures, and delivered that fish oil richness that bodies needed. The bones, mashed in with everything else, provided calcium that mountain diets often lacked. Workers would eat them with their hands, the crispy exterior giving way to that soft, fishy center. Some folks made them small, like silver dollar pancakes. Others preferred them larger, like hamburger patties. Either way, they represented prosperity in a can. Ocean fish making its way to landlocked hollows, providing protein when deer season was over and the chickens weren't laying. Cornbread with molasses poured over. This was different from cornbread and buttermilk. This was straight-up sweetness and density. Workers would take a thick square of cold cornbread, place it in the bottom of a tin pail or lunchbox, and pour dark molasses directly over it right before leaving for work. By lunchtime, the molasses had soaked completely through, turning the cornbread into something between cake and pudding. The contrast was remarkable. The gritty texture of stone-ground cornmeal against the smooth, almost treacly thickness of molasses. This combination was pure energy. The cornmeal provided complex carbohydrates that released slowly, while the molasses delivered immediate sugar rush and iron. From the 1890s through the 1940s, this lunch kept farmers in tobacco fields and miners underground functioning when they couldn't stop for a proper meal. The molasses added a deep, almost bitter sweetness, nothing like white sugar's clean taste. It had mineral notes, a slight sulfuric tang, and a richness that made plain cornbread taste luxurious. Folks would scrape the tin clean with their fingers, not wasting a drop of that thick, black gold syrup. Dried apple slices. Simple, portable, and nearly indestructible. From the late 1700s onward, Appalachian families dried apples every fall as insurance against winter and spring hunger. They'd core and slice apples thin, usually golden delicious or wine saps, and string them on thread or lay them on screens in the sun, sometimes in the rafters near the wood stove. After weeks of drying, the slices would shrink to leathery rings, concentrated with sugar and flavor. These went into every lunch pail. Workers would chew them slowly, rehydrating them slightly with saliva, releasing that intense apple sweetness. They were tough. You couldn't just bite through them. You had to gnaw and suck, making each piece last. The chewing motion itself was satisfying, giving jaw muscles something to do during breaks. These dried apples provided quick energy from natural sugars, required no refrigeration, wouldn't spoil for months, and weighed almost nothing. Loggers would carry pounds of them into week-long camps. Miners kept them in their pockets. Children would get a handful for school. In lean times, these apple rings might be the only sweet thing a family had, making them precious beyond their simple ingredients. Soup beans in mason jars. Hot food in a cold lunch wasn't common, but soup beans in mason jars solved the problem of portable protein. The night before, a mother would cook a pot of pinto beans, sometimes with a piece of fatback or ham bone for flavor, until they were soft and swimming in their own thick, starchy broth. While still hot, she'd ladle them into wide-mouth mason jars, seal them tight, and wrap them in newspaper or old towels. The insulation kept them warm for hours. By lunch, they'd still be lukewarm, and the flavors would have deepened as they sat. A worker would unscrew the lid and eat directly from the jar with a spoon carried in his pocket. The beans were creamy, rich with pork fat, and seasoned simply with salt and pepper. This wasn't fancy three-bean salad. These were survival beans, thick enough to be almost solid, providing plant protein when meat was scarce. From the 1900s through the 1950s, soup beans in jars sustained miners, loggers, and farmers. The jars were reusable, durable, and created their own mini-pressure cooking effect as they cooled, intensifying flavors naturally. Pickled eggs and cornbread. When chickens were laying heavily in spring and summer, mountain families pickled dozens of eggs to preserve them for leaner months. They'd hard-boil fresh eggs, peel them, and pack them into jars filled with vinegar brine, sometimes with beet juice for color, sometimes with hot peppers for bite. After a week in the brine, these eggs transformed into tangy, firm protein bombs. For lunch, a worker would grab 2 or 3 pickled eggs and a chunk of cornbread. The combination was strategic. The sharp, acidic punch of the vinegar egg cut through the dense, slightly sweet cornbread, creating a balanced meal that sat well in the stomach. The eggs provided protein and fat, the cornbread delivered carbohydrates, and the vinegar aided digestion during heavy labor. From the 1880s through the 1960s, this pairing was standard in coal camps and tobacco fields. The eggs were sour, salty, and had that distinctive pickled firmness. The yolk would be slightly dry and crumbly. Men would eat them whole, alternating bites of egg with bites of crumbling cornbread, washing everything down with creek water or weak coffee from a thermos. Vinegar pie. This might sound insane, but vinegar pie was genius economics. During lean times, especially the Great Depression, when eggs, butter, and fresh fruit were scarce or too valuable to use for pie, mountain cooks invented vinegar pie. The filling was simple: flour, sugar, water, a little butter if available, and a surprising amount of vinegar. Mix it together, pour it into a simple pastry crust, and bake until set. The vinegar's acidity activated the flour's starches, creating a custard-like filling without eggs or milk. The result tasted surprisingly like lemon pie, tart, sweet, and with a custardy texture. A slice of this pie, wrapped in wax paper, became a lunch pail treat. It was shelf-stable, didn't need refrigeration, and wouldn't spoil even in summer heat. The high sugar and acid content acted as preservatives. From the 1920s through the 1940s, vinegar pie represented Appalachian ingenuity, creating something that tasted like luxury from the cheapest ingredients in the pantry. Workers would eat it with their hands, the flaky crust shattering into crumbs, the filling providing quick energy and a reminder that home meant more than just survival. Bean sandwiches. Yes, beans between bread. This wasn't a joke, it was serious fuel. The night before, leftover pinto beans would be mashed slightly with a fork, creating a thick paste that could spread. In the morning, this bean paste went between 2 slices of bread, usually that thick, homemade farm bread that could handle moisture without disintegrating. No lettuce, no tomato, no condiments, just beans and bread. The beans provided protein and fiber, the bread gave carbohydrates, and the whole thing could survive hours in a lunch pail without falling apart. Some families added a little bacon grease to the beans for moisture and flavor. Others included a slice of raw onion for bite. From the 1900s through the 1960s, bean sandwiches sustained workers who couldn't afford meat daily. The sandwich was filling, cheap, and surprisingly satisfying. The beans' earthy, creamy texture contrasted with the bread's density. It stuck to your ribs, as the saying went, meaning it kept you full for hours of hard labor. Modern folks might turn their noses up, but to a tobacco farmer in 1935, this sandwich represented a full belly and the energy to finish a 12-hour day in the fields. Killed lettuce salad. Killed lettuce was fresh lettuce wilted with hot bacon grease and vinegar, a clever way to make greens last in a lunch pail. Early spring, when leaf lettuce first emerged in mountain gardens, was killed lettuce season. Women would tear fresh lettuce leaves into a bowl, fry several strips of bacon until crispy, then pour the hot grease directly over the greens while it was still sizzling. The lettuce would wilt immediately, hence killed. Add a splash of vinegar, crumble the bacon over top, and you had a warm, tangy, greasy salad that could be packed for lunch. By midday, it had cooled but remained edible and flavorful. The bacon grease coated each leaf, the vinegar provided acid that helped preserve everything, and the bacon pieces added protein and crunch. This wasn't health food by modern standards, but from the 1880s through the 1950s, it was a way to get fresh vegetables into working men's diets when vitamin deficiency was a real threat. The killed lettuce was slippery, tangy, smoky, and rich. Men would eat it from tin pails with their fingers or crude forks, enjoying the first fresh greens after a winter of dried beans and preserved meat. Raw ramps and biscuits. Ramps, wild leeks that grow in Appalachian forests each spring, were more than food. They were a ritual. From April through early May, families would forage hillsides for these pungent wild onions with their purple-stained bulbs and broad green leaves. Eating raw ramps was almost a rite of passage. Workers would pack several ramps and cold biscuits for lunch, eating them raw right there in the field or mine. The ramps were intensely strong, part garlic, part onion, part something wilder and more primal. They'd bite into the white bulb, the juice making their eyes water, then chase it with a chunk of biscuit to absorb the burn. The combination was harsh and wonderful, the aggressive sharpness of raw ramp against the bland, dense biscuit. Your breath would reek for days afterward, but everyone ate them, so everyone smelled the same. This was communal eating at its most basic. The ramps provided vitamins and minerals that winter diets had depleted. From the 1700s onward, mountain folks believed ramps thinned the blood after a heavy winter of salt meat and beans. Modern science suggests they were right. The sulfur compounds and vitamins did help bodies transition to spring work. Lard biscuits. These weren't just biscuits made with lard. They were biscuits that were mostly lard. During the leanest times, when flour was precious, mountain cooks made lard biscuits that were essentially lard held together with just enough flour to form a dough. Mix cold lard with minimal flour, a pinch of salt, and barely enough buttermilk to bring it together. Roll it out, cut circles, and bake until barely golden. The result was incredibly rich, almost greasy, and packed with calories. One or two of these biscuits could fuel a man through half a workday. They were dense, slightly crumbly, and left your fingers shiny with fat. From the 1890s through the 1940s, lard biscuits went into lunch pails when money was tight and bellies needed filling. Workers would eat them plain or with sorghum molasses, the sweetness cutting through the animal fat richness. These biscuits represented the reality of poverty. They were cheap calories when nothing else was available. Lard was rendered from hog butchering in the fall, stored in crocks, and used sparingly throughout the year. But when tobacco prices dropped or the mine closed for a month, lard biscuits kept families working until better times returned. Salt pork sandwiches. Before refrigeration, pork was preserved in salt, packed in wooden barrels with layers of coarse salt between each cut. The result was meat so salty it was almost inedible without preparation, but it would last for months. For lunch, families would slice salt pork thin, It looked like thick bacon, but white with fat, streaked with lean pink meat. They'd rinse it briefly in cold water to remove surface salt, then place it between two slices of bread. No cooking, no additional seasoning, just bread and extremely salty pork. The salt would leach into the bread as it sat in the lunch pail, seasoning each bite. This sandwich was pure sodium and fat, designed to replace what sweat took away during brutal labor. From the 1850s through the 1930s, salt pork sandwiches sustained miners, loggers, and farmhands. The pork was chewy, intensely salty, and the fat would sometimes be partially translucent and slippery. You'd need water afterward, lots of water. But that salt and fat combination kept muscles working and prevented the cramping that came from dehydration and sodium loss. These sandwiches weren't about taste, they were about biological necessity. Cornmeal mush cakes. Leftover cornmeal mush, that thick porridge made from cornmeal and water, got a second life as lunch. The night before, a family would cook cornmeal mush for supper, eating it hot with milk or buttermilk. The leftovers would be poured into a loaf pan and left to cool overnight. By morning, it had solidified into a firm, sliceable block. Cut thick slices, fry them in bacon grease until both sides were crispy and golden, and you had cornmeal mush cakes. These could go into a lunch pail still warm, or they'd be eaten cold hours later. Either way, they were substantial. Each cake was dense with cornmeal, crispy on the outside, soft and porridge-like inside. Some folks ate them with sorghum, others preferred them plain. From the 1880s through the 1950s, these cakes were standard lunch fare because they used up leftovers and required no additional ingredients. They were the ultimate stretching the budget food. A single batch of cornmeal could become multiple meals. Hot porridge for supper, fried cakes for lunch, and any remaining pieces could be crumbled into buttermilk for another meal. Nothing was wasted, and every transformation added value.
Corn pone. Before sliced bread became a thing, mountain families were already perfecting their own daily staple that could outlast store-bought loaves by weeks. In the late 1800s through the Great Depression, corn pone served as the foundation of mountain survival when wheat flour cost precious cash money that families simply didn't have. Women would mix coarse cornmeal with just enough water or buttermilk to form a thick paste, adding a pinch of salt and sometimes bacon grease for richness. The mixture was shaped by hand into thick, flat cakes and either baked on a hot stone by the fire or fried in a cast-iron skillet over wood coals. The outside developed a golden, crackling crust, while the inside stayed dense and moist, with a slightly gritty texture that satisfied hunger like nothing else could. A woman's reputation often rested on her corn pone recipe. Today's cornbread mixes can't touch the staying power of hand-mixed corn pone. Don't let these recipes disappear again. Subscribe and join our retro family for more forgotten favorites. Groundhog stew. If you think groundhogs were just for weather predictions, mountain families knew better. These plump, slow-moving rodents provided the first fresh meat after winter's lean months. In February, when families' preserved meat supplies ran dangerously low, adult males would hunt the newly awakened groundhogs emerging from hibernation. These animals had spent months building up fat reserves, making them surprisingly tender and flavorful. After skinning and cleaning, the groundhog was cut into chunks and soaked overnight in salt water to remove any wild gaminess. The meat was then browned in pork fat before being covered with water, wild onions, and whatever root vegetables the family had stored, typically potatoes, carrots, and turnips. The stew simmered for hours over a wood fire until the meat fell off the bone and the broth turned rich and golden. One groundhog could feed a family of 6 for days, making it precious winter protein when other meat was scarce. Possum and sweet potatoes. Before you wrinkle your nose, understand that possum was considered fine dining in mountain communities, especially when prepared with sweet potatoes for Sunday dinner. This dish represented the pinnacle of Appalachian game cooking, turning a humble marsupial into a feast worthy of special occasions. Possums were typically caught in late fall when they'd been feeding on persimmons and acorns, giving their meat a surprisingly sweet flavor. The preparation began with careful skinning and cleaning, followed by a thorough scrubbing and overnight soaking in salt water. The possum was then parboiled to remove any remaining wild taste before being stuffed with sweet potatoes, wild onions, and sage. The whole animal was roasted slowly in a Dutch oven buried in coals, basting frequently with its own fat mixed with molasses. The sweet potatoes inside absorbed the rich, slightly sweet meat juices, while the skin turned crispy and golden. Served with cornbread and wild greens, this was mountain fine dining that would make city folks reconsider their assumptions about country cooking. Squirrel and dumplings. When winter meat supplies ran low, mountain families turned to the abundant squirrels that populated every hollow and ridge. This dish transformed small game into a hearty meal that could stretch to feed unexpected company. Squirrel hunting was a rite of passage for mountain boys, and preparing squirrel and dumplings was considered essential knowledge for mountain wives. The process began with cleaning and jointing 2 or 3 squirrels, then browning the pieces in bacon grease until golden. The meat was covered with water and simmered with wild onions and herbs until tender enough to fall off the bone. Meanwhile, dumplings were made from simple ingredients: flour, salt, and enough water or milk to form a stiff dough that could be rolled thin and cut into strips. These dumplings were dropped into the bubbling squirrel broth, where they puffed up and absorbed the rich, gamey flavor. The finished dish featured tender meat swimming in thick, dumpling-studded gravy that tasted like comfort itself. One pot could feed a family for 2 meals, making it economical as well as delicious. Turtle soup with cornbread. Mountain streams and ponds provided more than just water. They offered protein in the form of snapping turtles that could weigh 20 pounds or more. This wasn't backwoods desperation food. Turtle soup was considered a delicacy that rivaled anything served in fancy city hotels. Catching snapping turtles required courage and skill, as these prehistoric-looking creatures could snap off fingers with their powerful jaws. Once caught, the turtle was cleaned and the meat removed from the shell, revealing surprisingly tender flesh that tasted like a cross between chicken and fish. The preparation was elaborate, befitting its special status. The turtle meat was cut into chunks and slowly simmered with wild onions, herbs, and root vegetables until it fell apart. Some cooks added hard-boiled eggs and a splash of vinegar for tang. The finished soup was thick, rich, and deeply flavorful, served alongside fresh cornbread to soak up every drop. Turtle soup was reserved for special occasions and honored guests, proving that mountain cuisine could rival any city restaurant when ingredients and skill combined. Fried catfish and hush puppies. Mountain streams provided more than just cool water. They were home to whiskered catfish that became the centerpiece of legendary fish fries that brought entire communities together. These weren't delicate trout fishing expeditions. Catching catfish required patience, strong hands, and sometimes the courage to reach into dark holes where big cats lurked. Fresh-caught catfish were cleaned and skinned, revealing firm, white meat that was surprisingly sweet and mild despite the fish's muddy reputation. The fillets were soaked in buttermilk to remove any earthy taste, then dredged in seasoned cornmeal that created a golden, crunchy coating when fried in hot lard. Alongside the fish came hush puppies, cornmeal fritters mixed with chopped onions and dropped by spoonfuls into the same hot fat. Legend says hush puppies got their name from cooks who tossed them to barking dogs with the command, "Hush puppies." The combination of crispy outside, flaky inside catfish with hot, sweet hush puppies created a meal that satisfied both body and soul, proving that mountain cuisine could compete with any coastal seafood. Fried green tomato sandwich. Late summer in rural Georgia and the Carolinas meant the frost was coming and gardens had to be harvested fast. These thick sliced green tomatoes were dredged in seasoned cornmeal, fried in cast iron, until their exteriors turned golden brown and crispy, while the inside stayed firm and tart. Slapped between two slices of soft white bread with a smear of mayonnaise, this sandwich represented the thin window between summer and winter. The beauty wasn't just the taste, it was the texture. That crunch gave way to the tangy brightness of the barely ripe fruit, cut by the richness of the mayo. In small mountain towns and tobacco country, this sandwich meant resourcefulness. Nothing got wasted. Every tomato, even the ones that wouldn't ripen in time, became dinner. Families shared these at church socials, packed them in lunch pails for field work, and served them at supper when cash crops were being harvested. Today, this sandwich survives in southern soul food restaurants, a reminder that creativity and hunger birthed some of America's greatest comfort foods. Bean loaf sandwich. Dried beans were the protein backbone of rural southern life in the early 1970s. Cheap, shelf-stable, and nutritious enough to keep families healthy on minimal income. Bean loaves were made by mashing cooked beans with breadcrumbs, egg, onion, and seasoning, then baking them into loaves similar to meatloaf. Sliced thick and fried until the edges crisped in cast iron, these sandwiches had an earthy, dense texture that was deeply satisfying. Placed between buttered bread with a slice of cheese and a smear of mustard, they offered complete protein, beans and bread, creating the amino acids needed for a day's work. In rural Mississippi and Arkansas, bean loaf sandwiches were Tuesday supper, often made on Mondays when the week's beans were already cooked. Mothers packed them in lunch pails for children walking to one-room schoolhouses. They were humble, unglamorous, and absolutely essential to survival. The loaf held together perfectly and stayed fresher longer than meat sandwiches. What made this remarkable was how a simple mash of beans transformed into something that felt substantial and nourishing, proving that resourcefulness and care could create dignity even in desperate circumstances. Leather britches. Don't let the name fool you. These weren't pants, but green beans transformed into leathery strips that could hang from the rafters all winter long. This preservation method turned summer's abundance into winter's sustenance without requiring expensive canning equipment or precious salt. The process began during peak bean season when mountain gardens produced more fresh beans than families could eat. Young, tender green beans were strung on heavy thread using a large needle, creating long garlands that looked like green necklaces. These bean strings were hung from kitchen rafters, porch ceilings, or attic beams where air could circulate freely around them. Over several weeks, the beans dried into brown, wrinkled strips that rattled like leather when touched, hence the name leather britches. Come winter, handfuls of the dried beans were soaked overnight to rehydrate, then cooked slowly with fatback or bacon until tender. The finished beans had a concentrated, slightly smoky flavor that fresh beans couldn't match. This ancient preservation method kept families fed with vegetables long after gardens lay buried under snow. Southern beans and cornbread. This wasn't just a meal, it was the foundation of mountain survival, a perfect protein combination that could sustain families through the leanest times. The magic happened when dried beans and cornmeal joined forces, creating a complete protein that rivaled expensive meat in nutritional value. Mountain families grew their own beans, usually tough varieties like pintos or navy beans that could withstand harsh weather and poor soil. These dried beans were soaked overnight, then slow cooked for hours with a piece of fatback or ham hock until they became creamy and rich.